Živijo, tukaj je Anže, poslušate podcast Aparatus, kjer legitimni člani družbe povejo, kaj počnejo v življenju. Tole pa je 71. epizoda Aparatusa, v kateri sem govoril z Jasonom Snellom, se pravi bo že spet epizoda, ki je v angleščini. On je v bistvu šefe podcasta The Incomparable, ki je na ene parih točkah dosti podoben našim glavam, tle na mreži Aparatus. Drugače pa za urednika Macworlda, Tech Hive in pa PC Worlda, se pravi on je editorial director v bistvu na firmi IDG, ki je zadolžnik vseh teh trih revij in spletnih strani. Pogovarjala so se valjda pol o medijih, o internetu, na začetku pa ful preveč o Star Treku, ki je tak fan, ki jaz, pa malo Twilight Zone. Naprej začnemo pa še enkrat ful hvala vsem, ki ste že podprli Aparatus, če pa to hočete narediti in imate možnost, pa to lahko naredite tako, da greste na aparatus.si/podpri. Vsak evro prav pride, tako da če imate šanso, ful hvala. Nič, evo, zdaj pa Jason. Thank you for doing this, I guess, because it was fast, and I guess Glenn's emails work.
Glenn, that's the power of Glenn.
Yeah, I think he's been very generous. I just got the magazine, the book. I guess that's what it's called.
That's what it's called.
He sent me a copy, so
that's
I've been
great.
reading that. So we're gonna start, I guess.
All right.
I don't have like a jingle or anything at the start, so I always start with the same question, which is, who are you and what do you do?
I am Jason Snell, and it's a great question what I do. I think my Twitter bio says I write and talk and stuff, which is about it. My job is the editorial director at IDG Consumer, so we're the publishers of Macworld, PC World, Tech Hive, and Greenbot, 4 websites focused on different aspects of consumer technology. So I'm the manager of the whole editorial department. So all of our editors ultimately report to me. The 4 editors-in-chief of those 4 websites report to me. It's a management job, and I don't love lots of parts of it because my heart is closer to the content. I've been working the last few months to get closer to the content because for something like 8 or 9 years, I was the editor-in-chief of Macworld, and that's generally, I think, what I'm most known for. And then the other thing, as a part of this job, I write stories. I manage our editorial process. I host a podcast for Tech Hive called Clockwise. And in my spare time, I do a podcast called The Incomparable, which is about pop culture. And we've got a couple of spin-offs of that, all of which you can find at theincomparable.com. And that's sort of what I do. That's one of my I've always had a side project, creative outlet at some point, throughout my adult life. I've always had something on the side that sort of I can do and I can control while I've been doing the main thing, whether it's school or work. And The Incomparable is that right now.
Yeah, so I guess we'll start with The Incomparable and then get back, because I want to talk to you about writing and publishing, because I'm an online editor now, basically. I'm an editor now, which sounds weird to me. But yeah, I do want to talk about The Incomparable because that's, again, one of those shows I listen to. Like,
oh, that's great.
Yeah, and you are the sole reason I recently rewatched the entire Star Trek, the original series.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was a while. Like I don't know when I last watched it, but when I heard you guys talk about it, I just went through the whole thing again. I tried to get my girlfriend into it, but she gave up after about 2 episodes. I think that didn't work out. But yeah, so okay. So for anybody that doesn't know, like, explain The Incomparable, I guess.
Wow. Explain The Incomparable. So what happened is we, a bunch of people I know, mostly computer related in some way, we're talking on Twitter about like sci-fi novels or something like that. And I said, there ought to be a podcast, famous last words, where we talk about this stuff. Because that would be fun, because we're friends and we know each other from technology stuff, but we obviously have this interest in sci-fi and fantasy and movies and TV shows and books and stuff like that. So that's how it started, and it essentially is a group of people. I'd say it's a group of friends. Some of us were friends before we started, and some of us have become friends as we've been doing it. It started out as maybe acquaintances of some of the people, but it's sort of grown into a larger group who people fall kind of in and out based on topic, and we're pretty broad with the topic. It's not a comic book podcast or a Star Trek podcast or a Marvel Comics movies podcast or a sci-fi novels only podcast. It's none of those things. It's kind of anything that interests us that we think is fun and cool and that we want to talk about that is broadly, I would say, in the kind of geek pop culture variety, which is, we're not talking about a lot of mainstream, serious stuff. There usually is a nerdy angle to it, although we've gone back and we've redefined that in a lot of ways. We did a board games episode, and we have done a few installments of this thing called Old Movie Club, where we watch movies from the 50s, 60s, 70s, which is nerdery of a different kind, but it's still nerdery, which I think is really the unifying theme. Is it's geeky enthusiasm about pop culture one way or another. So we do that every week, and then we have a side thing that we spun off where we play Dungeons and Dragons. We did it once sort of on a lark, and people really liked it, and we had fun playing. So that's turned into a side podcast called Total Party Kill, which is actually a lot of fun. I'd never played Dungeons and Dragons before, and I've had a blast with that. And it's fun. At its core, it is a chance for me to have a creative outlet and also to talk about this stuff that I love and that I watch or play or read, and with people who also are enthusiastic about it, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, because the reason I had you say that, and it's not me saying it in the intro, is basically because I do a similar show here where I've stolen a bunch of concepts from you guys. We've been doing this podcast.
That is a great compliment. Thank you.
No, the draft, mainly the draft. I love the draft. The drafts you guys do, those are by far my favorite shows. So, and we've done a bunch of them because our show started as a Game of Thrones podcast because the guy I do it with, he's the main co-host. He actually translated all of the R.R. Martin books into Slovene. So,
wow!
We start. Yeah. He's still translating. He's translating some of the short stories now, I think, of Martin's. Yeah. So we started with the Game of Thrones, and then we sort of expanded into everything else. But we mostly stick to TV, but we've done some movie ones. But yeah, the drafts we basically stole from you guys. So.
It's I mean that's been floating out there for a while. I there's a sports podcast that I listen to that they did ridiculous fantasy drafts, and I think that's basically all they do now. And I always thought it was a fun way to do it. I did fantasy football and baseball and things like that, and you draft players, and I thought it would be. It really is just an excuse for everybody to make a list of things they like and talk about them, and at its base level, that's good. And then it adds this slight area of competitiveness where if somebody else picks it, you don't get to pick it, although you can still talk about it. And so we actually did one last night. As we're recording this, we recorded one last night, and the same guy, one guy was right in front of the other guy, and they had similar tastes. And so every time the first guy would pick, the second guy would be like, "Oh, you took my pick." But then it was like he got two picks because he got to talk about this guy's pick and then his own pick. So it's a fun excuse, and it adds a little competitive aspect, but in the end, it's just a group of people talking about stuff they're enthusiastic about and why they like it, and that's fun. So I admit I'm kind of addicted to the draft format. I'm trying not to do too many of them, and I think I failed recently because we did a computer games draft, we did a best robots draft, we did a best computers draft. And that's a lot of drafts. So I'm trying to space them out, but it's fun. It's a great way to. Not every week can be let's closely watch a classic movie. You got to vary it, and the drafts are more like a sampler of 20 things that are great instead of just one, and lets everybody get their enthusiasms out. So it's a lot of fun to do it. I wouldn't do it if it wasn't fun, and it is a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's the same here. We just try to get a list of 10 things somebody should see, basically.
Lists are fun. We've done a bunch of book episodes that it's literally just, I think we call it the reading list, summer reading list, winter reading list, and it's just an excuse for people to card out some of their favorite books. And the response to those episodes is great because people they find out, oh, there's somebody I like, and they don't generally know us, but they listen to us, so they feel like they know us pretty well. And they're like, oh, they recommended this book, I'm going to go read it. And that's great. And from our perspective, it's just, I'm going to tell you about some books I like. But it serves a useful purpose, I think, in that people want to check that stuff out. And because somebody's endorsed it as a favorite. Yeah,
that's why I read Red Shirts, basically.
Yeah, book. Sure. Yeah. Sure. That's a weird book.
But if you're a fan of Star Trek, I think it's one of the best. I think dealing with the whole universe. But yeah, so okay, I do want to talk about Star Trek a little. I'm sorry, because
let's do it.
Yeah. I'm talking about you specifically, like your enthusiasm about the original series, especially the first 2 seasons, right, was really what made me watch the whole thing again. Right? So I'm just asking, like, because you're American, you're a little older than me. Like you saw him when you were a kid on like TV or in the rerun stages, like when it was in syndication.
It was in syndication because it went off the air. I think about a year. It went off the network about a year before I was born. So I wasn't even alive to see it on NBC when it originally aired. But so John Siracusa and Dan Morin and Tony Sindelar and a bunch of guys who are on the podcast John's maybe 5 or 6 years younger than me, and Dan and Tony are about 10 years younger than me. And so they talk about Star Wars, for example, and they say, I can't remember life before Star Wars. And for me, I can remember life before Star Wars. I can, in fact, as a Star Trek fan, I remember it being kind of usurped, the title of like famous space thing went from Star Trek all of a sudden in 1977. It was Star Wars. And I remember being kind of bent out of shape about that a little bit, although I saw Star Wars in the theater a couple of times and I really loved it. So I wasn't too mad about it. I did love it. For me, though, Star Trek fills that role, that I can't remember not knowing about Star Trek. So it was in syndication. There was one of the channels. We only got about 4 channels. It was one of the channels. They ran it every day at, I think, 5 o'clock. It might have been 6 some of the time and 5 some of the time. But in the evening, every day, 5 days a week. And I watched it religiously, and I cannot remember not watching it. I must have been 4 or 5 when I started watching it. And I do remember watching it at 5 or 6 or somewhere in there when my memories go back, and reach that point. And because I remember also that in 1977 or something like that, when I was 6 years old, they ran the animated series, and I didn't even know it existed. And I was like, "What is this?" And I remember being really, really excited about it, which means I already had all the original series committed to memory. So for me, it is. I get when Dan and John talk about how Star Wars is sort of imprinted on them. They knew Star Wars before they knew themselves, essentially. That's what it's like for me. And Star Trek, the original series, it was the thing that I grabbed onto that imprinted itself on me. And, Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock and Dr. McCoy are, it sounds ridiculous to say this, but they are a part of me in a way that probably a lot of, maybe most other pop culture stuff is not, because it hit me at that perfect moment and became, a part of my childhood experience. They were like childhood friends in a way that Star Wars, I remember those were great movies when I was a kid growing up. Star Trek, I just can't imagine life without it. It's just there's a little difference there.
That's the answer I wanted, basically.
I'm happy to provide that for you. Yeah, it's funny, and I don't know what that difference is, but that to me is the difference. Is if you can't even remember life without it, then it's just then it's not something you ever discovered in life. As you get older, the world becomes almost entirely things that you discover, and you think that's life as you find new things. But there's that moment when you're a child where you can look back and say, these are the things that just I assumed were part of the world, like a car, where if you were born before there were cars, that's not the case. But now everybody who's alive remembers that cars are just a part of the world. Well, Star Trek was always a part of the world. It didn't come into the world for me. I never discovered it in any way that I can remember. It was just always there for me. And that makes it different somehow from all of the other stuff that I've come to love that came after it.
Okay, so and when you guys talked about like Star Trek, you mentioned the Twilight Zone, the original one, a couple of times.
Right.
And like recently through some, slightly illegal like tinkering, I've actually gotten my hands on like Netflix. So I have Netflix now, which is technically not available in Slovenia. I'm paying for it, but it's, it's not really here. But you can do it with some DNS stuff.
I think if you're paying for it, good for you. I would endorse that approach.
Yeah. Well, that's what I keep telling myself. So, so the entire Twilight Zone is actually available there. I've never seen that, but because I heard you mention that some of the Star Trek episodes were basically just copied like Twilight Zone episodes with like Charlie X and stuff. Right?
Yeah,
that's supposed to be So I'm watching the Twilight Zone now. I think I'm like 20 episodes in. This has been like the last month before I go to bed. I just watch a Twilight Zone episode. So I just wanted to ask you, since you're you're my focal point here. Was America like? You see, the thing is, like, I've seen like old movies, like old American movies, but I haven't seen much like black and white American TV, because everything I've seen was, in color,
right.
maybe from the 70s on. Like, but it's like proper, like from 1959 and stuff. So like, how was that in America? Like, was that actually America, or is that like a Hollywood version of it? If you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
well, I was born in 1970, so I can't.
No, I get that, but I'm just saying, like, you saw some of the black and white stuff because it was on TV there, and it was never on TV here.
Right.
And like very few of those shows sort of have are like the Twilight Zone, that you can watch them now and not just feel completely embarrassed by the production value and all of that stuff.
Right. Well, the black and white, it's like HD now. I mean, I feel like the black and white shows, there was a divide and almost nothing was shown after a certain point or exported, because people didn't want black and white TV anymore. They wanted color. Yeah. Just like now, this is why all the studios are going back and trying to convert all their old shows that were done on film to HD, is because there's an investment there. People at some point are just going to refuse to watch something that's not in HD. But the Twilight Zone, it was such a different show. It stayed on the air when most of the black and white, like some shows that were shot in black and white to begin with and then shot in color later, they literally like stopped syndicating the black and white seasons because nobody wanted to see them. So there's a season of Gilligan's Island that's in black and white that I've never seen, and I watched every episode of that. I believe there are a couple seasons of Bewitched that were shot in black and white. I mean, so there was like, we're not going to even talk about those because we can't sell them in syndication. I imagine those studios, they should colorize them, is what they should do, because then they could sell them again. But so the Twilight Zone survived because, partially I think because the black and white is sort of moody, and it actually kind of fits the subject matter, because it is strange and spooky and serious, and because it had a huge cult following that was more among horror genre fans than sci-fi fans, although that's not entirely fair to paint the Twilight Zone with that brush. I certainly, the people I knew who loved the Twilight Zone, I was never a huge Twilight Zone fan. Those people were horror fans. They loved, and in fact, Steve Lutz on our podcast, he's a horror guy and he's a Twilight Zone guy. So I think there's some affinity there for some of those stories. But that is, and it's funny too, because Rod Serling, although he's legendary, I think would be considered maybe the greatest writer in television history if it weren't for the fact that he wrote primarily in a genre, in this, sci-fi horror genre of the Twilight Zone, because people look down on that sort of thing. But, he gathered around him these brilliant writers, and they made these little plays, these little 25-minute anthology show plays. And that's the other downside of the Twilight Zone, is that, you don't have characters to glom onto like you do with Star Trek, where it's the same people every week. It's new. It's a new play. It's a new story every single week. So they're much more like short stories than like, a novel with the characters that you follow through. But it's brilliant stuff. And it is in the Hollywood. And this is one of the things that I think they've got in common. They have writers in common, Star Trek and the Twilight Zone, but also that Hollywood production thing. Like, I'm a fan of Doctor Who, and when you look at the 60s and 70s Doctor Who, it's not a Hollywood show. It is
That's putting it mildly.
Well, I know, but just in terms of the way it's made, I mean, you can tell that in Britain they had a stage tradition, and so in Britain the idea of TV was you get a bunch of stage actors in a room with a bunch of cameras, and you just film it. And Hollywood was this movie-making machine, and A movies, but also B movies, westerns, action adventure. And if you look at the Twilight Zone and you look at Star Trek, that's what you're seeing, is those came out of they're TV and not movies, but they are out of the Hollywood production system, and they're shot like, if you look at something like Forbidden Planet, Star Trek is essentially a ripoff of Forbidden Planet. I don't really like that movie, but it looks exactly like Forbidden Planet, and it's shot like Forbidden Planet. And that's the thing, is that these shows were made by the people who made movies in Hollywood in the 50s and 60s, and it feels like it. And so they've got that in common too. And I suppose if we watched Have Gun Will Travel or Gunsmoke or something like that from that era, you'd get a similar kind of feel. But through 50 years of history, I think that's one of the things that comes through from both of those, is that they feel, they may feel old, but they feel kind of glossy and well made in a way, because they came out of that machine that was just for 50 years already had been spitting out, adventure stories and westerns and things like that.
Yeah, and with the Twilight Zone and some of Star Trek, the writing's actually like pretty good. I mean, for like when you factor in when those two shows were made, I mean, because like I've just seen those two from like that period. I get, well, it's 10 years in between, I guess, but just I don't know, like American TV wasn't all like that, right? I mean, that's just
there were anthology shows like Alfred Hitchcock Presents is an example of an American TV show anthology series with that was the mystery thriller suspense companion to the sci-fi horror fantasy of Twilight Zone. They're similar in a lot of ways. No, it wasn't like that. You mentioned the writing. I mean, Gene Roddenberry wasn't a very good writer, let's just be honest. And he had some decent writers around him. But, he also made some decisions that, I mean, he created Star Trek and that's great, but he also made some decisions that probably prevented the writing from being as good as it could have been. And he surrounded himself with some good writers, but there were also some bad writers. Twilight Zone, Rod Serling was legitimately one of the best writers of the 20th century. I mean, I say that I'm trying to check myself and not overhype it, but I mean, seriously, among television writers, he's certainly in the top 5 for the 20th century. Yeah. If not the top 2. I think Paddy Chayefsky and Rod Serling are generally considered the 2 best TV writers of the 20th century, with good reason. And so he surrounded himself. He got Richard Matheson as a really good example, and a bunch of other amazing writers. And because there were no stars, strangely, it ends up being a writer's show. I mean, the writer ran it. The writer was the host. And so it's a writer's show. And because they didn't have to fit a format, it could be about anything every week. And so the writing really came out. Whereas something like Star Trek, Harlan Ellison writes The City on the Edge of Forever. And I've got that original screenplay, and it's really good, but it's not Star Trek. And so Harlan's mad because Dorothy Fontana rewrote it into a Star Trek episode, and it's the best Star Trek episode, but it's not Harlan's story because it has to fit. And in the Twilight Zone, it was their story, or Outer Limits, which was a follow-on, and which Harlan Ellison wrote for, very similar, or Night Gallery, which Rod Serling did in the 70s. So yeah, that was part of that anthology TV show tradition, which kind of doesn't exist anymore. But what is like that today is that TV is, again, more of a writer's medium. Generally, this concept of a showrunner, that person is a writer, they're the head writer, and they're the executive producer, and they're in charge of the show, and they control every aspect of it. And that's, I think, why TV is so good today, is because the writers are in charge and they are making decisions based on their storytelling. And that wasn't true for a lot of TV history, but it was true with the Twilight Zone. And I think that's why the Twilight Zone endures.
Yeah, and that's a great comparison with the TV that's coming out of America these days, because like since like the early 2000s, I guess, it's just gone up and up and up. And because, in the 90s, the TV drama was, I don't know what the best one was, but, compared to today, they were pretty lame, I guess.
Yeah, certainly in percentage-wise. I mean, there were some, like, NYPD Blue had
the early seasons were,
Right, had a couple of really great writers at the center of it, and Homicide: Life on the Street was sort of similar, but and that led to The Wire, which was great. Game of Thrones is an example where Weiss and Benioff, right, who are the guys who do it, they're writers and producers, and they run that show, but they're also the writers, and it means that they have creative control. Or something like True Detective, there's a guy who wrote that series, and he was the showrunner, and he worked with one director, and it's like an 8-hour long movie, but it's his vision. He doesn't have, the director works for him, right? And there's no, I mean, the studio I'm sure gives notes, but it's much more of a singular vision than a kind of I think in the last 20 years, before this last 5 or 10, it was much more of a kind of a product where the writer was interchangeable, and it was either about the star or it was about the producer, and the writers didn't matter. And the rise of the writer, I think, is why there's so much good TV now that wasn't there before. And I'm sure Rod Serling would love it, because that was his thing. Is he was a writer who wanted complete creative control and ended up getting it most of the time.
Yeah, 'cause I wrote an article about True Detective for the magazine I write for, right? And that was sort of my point, that it kind of, it's a TV show that's sort of almost like a movie, but yeah, there's a showrunner, which I guess that I don't know, was the show, like the showrunner, was that job even like a thing in the 80s or the 90s? Like, was anybody even called the showrunner?
I think the showrunner term, I've got a book that I borrowed like 10 years ago from Lisa Schmeiser, and I haven't given it back, called The Showrunners, which is a profile of a few people. And that was in the late 90s, I want to say. And I think that's when the concept really came into view. Before then, there were producers and there were writers. And I think the showrunner as a concept of the writer creative lead on the show, the idea that was the person in charge, but they hired producers to do the production technical stuff, but the boss was the writer. That seemed to be mostly happen in the 90s, I would say. But there are lots of exceptions. I mean, there are always exceptions. I think Stephen Bochco with Hill Street Blues in the 80s was an example of that. In the early 80s, there were some. There's some examples like that along the way, where there was a writer who had enough clout to be the sort of writer and producer and do it all. Joe Straczynski for Babylon 5 was an example of that, where he was the boss and he wrote almost every episode of it. And Joss Whedon, obviously, that was, now he's sort of the showrunner of the Marvel movies, but he was with Buffy. That was his thing. So, but it was a late 90s, early 2000s sort of change, and I'm not quite sure why it came to that point. I think maybe it's because, as strange as this is to believe, that they realized that the product was better if the writer was in charge.
No, that's
I know
not the answer.
It seems crazy, but I think maybe even the executives realized that the writers had a better creative vision, especially if you could surround them with people. That's certainly the model now for most shows, which not all shows. Some shows are less like that. But when you look at Community with Dan Harmon, he doesn't write every episode, but he's the showrunner, and they fired him, and then they brought him back.
It showed for that season, but it sort of showed that he wasn't around.
It's not a singular vision. Movies and TV are never a singular vision, but having a person in the seat who's making the decisions, who actually is also the person making the creative decisions, is a good thing, and you're seeing that replicated. Like I mentioned, Doctor Who. That's what they do now. Is Russell T Davies brought it back, and he was the showrunner, and he was the writer, and he had veteran producers around him to make the show happen, but he was the boss. And likewise now, Stephen Moffat, it's the same thing. He's the boss, and that's good. I think it shows in all of these shows where the writer is the showrunner.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for somebody to screw that up. I'm just waiting for that to go away, because somehow, like, they're gonna screw that system up, and it's gonna go back to the executives basically writing the final drafts or something.
Yeah. Although I think that was the Community. I think that was the idea: is let's just get rid of this guy. And the fact that they went back to Dan Harmon for the 5th season, I don't know. Maybe. It'll be interesting to see. There are both shows out there, right? There are shows that are less singular visions that are successful. I think something like The Big Bang Theory is wildly successful, and that is a Chuck Lorre show. But it's a writer's room, and he is a writer and he is the producer of it. But it feels less of a singular vision and more of an old-fashioned, comedy machine that has been set up by the studio. But in this case, there is a writer at the head of even that show. So I don't know, but like something like Shonda Rhimes, who does Grey's Anatomy and Scandal, she's a writer producer and very successful. So you're seeing that a lot. But yeah, I do fear that moment where they're like, these writers, we got to get rid of them. They're no good.
Yeah.
Can we do the show without writers?
Yeah, the thing is, like, you mentioned Shonda Rhimes. That's the thing that kind of surprised me in the last couple of years, because that format, like the showrunner show, basically showed up on network TV. Because I just thought that would never really happen. Because I get it, like on premium cable, that can happen, because it's it's a sort of a closed system, if you know what I mean. But like on network TV, even like a show like House. basically sort of had like somebody watching over that show, or Shonda Rhimes, as you said, with Grey's Anatomy.
Right.
And like, so do you have any idea why that can happen on network TV as well? Because I just have this really pessimistic view of American network television, where I've basically given up almost.
Well, what's funny is that the network television in the U.S. the ratings have gone down to the point where popular cable shows actually beat them in the ratings, which is mind-boggling. But like The Walking Dead, which is a basic cable show, not a premium cable show, beats network shows in the ratings. It's amazing. So the networks are finally starting to change their development cycle, where they're not putting everything on in the fall and then in the spring and then nothing in the summer. They're changing that to more year-round schedules. They're changing how they order shows. They used to do a lot of 22 episode orders, or they'd pick up 13 and then they'd order the back 9 if it did well. They're doing a lot of different orders, like Sleepy Hollow, which was a big hit, was given a 13 episode order, and it did very well. And the producers, they were building a 13 episode season, and there seemed to be an agreement that if it succeeded, what they would do is renew it for another 13 episode season, not a back 9. And that's what they did. When it did well in the ratings, everybody expected them to order 9 more episodes, and instead Fox said, we will order 13 more for next year. And that's, that's a big change from the old network approach of we're gonna do 22 episodes a year until it and we don't care how good they are until it's done. And that's changing now. So I mean, I think you'll still see sitcoms go for 22 episodes, but even a lot of sitcom orders are like Community's order was 13. Parks and Recreation's order was 13, and those shows may come back. It used to be if you got 13 and not picked up for more, you were dead.
Done, basically, yeah.
And I don't think that's now networks are saying, well, we're going to run this one for 13 in the fall. We'll run this one for 13 in the spring and summer. We'll run this for 8 in the summer. And it's much more like cable. And I think that's where we're headed is for these things, or British TV, actually. It's a lot like British TV, where there's no longer any expectation that show is going to be in that time slot every week all year round, but instead there'll be events, and you'll be very excited to come and see your 10 episodes of Game of Thrones or your 13 episodes of Community, and then it'll go away for a while and it'll come back later. And that's very different, but I think in the end that's going to be good. I think, again, this is one of those strange moments where the cable stuff, which generally has been pretty good quality, and the networks are like, well, why don't we try that? And we'll see what happens, whether they screw that one up or not.
There's always that possibility with American networks, I think. But yeah, you're right. The event thing is kind of awesome. I think that's what happened with the last Sherlock season. The BBC's Sherlock, the good one.
Right.
Like, that was that was a thing. Even over here, I mean, like, people just knew about it. And of course, we did like 3 podcasts on it. That's sort of a change that I don't know. I hope they don't, like you said, I just hope they don't screw it up somehow, because that it just might happen, I guess. But that's me being pessimistic, maybe.
Yeah.
We have to talk about the stuff you actually do. We just spent a half an hour.
The things I get paid much more to do. Yes.
When you said you're not as close to the content anymore, I guess, but I still see you writing online. I mean, you're like on Tech Hive and Macworld and stuff. So
yeah.
When did you start? Specifically, when did you start writing about technology? Because I think we're a special breed that people actually like to do that.
So when I was in elementary school, I liked to write and I loved computers. And in high school, that continued. I was on my student newspaper, but I also ran a computer bulletin board. And so when I got to college, I worked on the college newspaper. Ended up as the editor-in-chief my senior year. And I was simultaneously, we had just, the newspaper had just gotten Macs to do all of its publishing. So that was the first time I used a Mac, really. I had an Apple II at that point, an old Apple II. And I bought my first Mac that year. I was like, oh, yeah, I'm going to get one of these. I got some money out of the college college account. And I was like, I don't know if I can pay for the last quarter, but I'm going to get this Mac now. I have to get this Mac now. And I was wiring, I was the editor-in-chief, and I was also wiring the local talk network in the office so that we could move files around instead of having to, because we had one Mac 2 and a bunch of Mac SEs, and if you wanted to print on the 600 DPI size of a truck image setter, you had to put your PageMaker file on a floppy disk and walk it over to the Mac 2, kick off who was ever on the Mac 2, and then print it. And, by the time I left there, you could print from any of the computers. We'd also upgraded, and we had more Mac 2s at that point. But we had one with it didn't even have color. It had grayscale. Ooh. But you could print from any of them, and you could also copy your files over the network. So if you wanted to get on the faster computer, you didn't have to walk it over SneakerNet with a floppy. And so this is the story I'm trying to tell, is that I was really into the technology and I was into writing and editing. And those were always the two areas I was interested in. So when I went to graduate school, I went to journalism school mostly because the economy was bad. There weren't very many jobs and I didn't really want to work at a weekly newspaper somewhere. So I went to journalism school figuring I'll find out if I want to do broadcast, which I decided I didn't want to do TV. That was a good lesson learned, and because I didn't really love the medium, and also you make connections. And I met a senior editor at Mac User magazine, who was a journalism school graduate who was now teaching there, and I got her to get me an internship at Mac User, and they liked me, and so they hired me. There were a couple months where I was freelance writing for them a little bit, and then I got another job offer that was not nearly as good, and they were like, "Oh, wait, we will offer you a job," and they offered me a job. And literally from there, so I started as an intern, then was an assistant editor, and in '97 they shut down Mac User and transferred a bunch of us to Macworld, and I went to Macworld then. So I went from intern to senior vice president and editorial director. It took like 20 years for that all to happen, but so that was really it, is that I expressed an interest to that editor, Pam Piffner. I said, my mom wants to know what I'm doing this summer as an internship. Give me an internship. And she's like, all right, I'll work it out. And I bugged her for weeks, and I got an internship. And I loved it because then I was doing both simultaneously. I was writing about Macs, and I was playing with the technology, the tech toys, and getting to write about them, and starting my media career. So that really was it. Is I was combining an enthusiasm with of technology with my skills that I had been building up as a writer and an editor. And so it was fun. It was a great combination. And so looking back, I would say that in some ways, if you were somebody who knew me in high school, you would not be shocked, to find that this is my career path. Now, when I went to my high school reunion, what I found out, see, I've been saying this, and now I've sort of invalidated it, because what I found out when I went to my high school reunion is some of the people remember me as a computer guy, and some of the people remember me as a media guy, a video or newspaper or writer kind of guy. But nobody seemed, except for some of my closest friends from then, to remember that I did both. So it's like some of them were surprised that I was in the media, but they weren't surprised about the computers. And some of them were surprised about computers, but not the media. But anyway, I don't think my career path has been too shocking, because I was interested in this stuff. In 7th grade, I was interested in these two things. And I've been very fortunate that I've been able to combine both of them for as long as I have. So that's sort of it. It came out of a dual interest. I'm not one of those people who was like, well, technology, that seems marketable, I'll write about that. It was like, no, I was a tech obsessed person. I loved it. I was always one of the computer people. And but I was also a media obsessed person. I had a radio show in high school. We had a high school radio station. I worked at the high school newspaper, and we had a video production class, and I made videos, both movies and also some news kind of stuff. So it was, both of those were always there.
Okay, yeah, that sort of makes sense, I guess, because I didn't know you were at Mac User and then Macworld the whole time. I figured there was a break in between that somewhere.
The whole time.
Wow. Okay, so that's sort of.
I've never quit a job or left a job to go to another job in my professional career. Not yet, anyway. I imagine that will happen here at some point. But because I like starting an intern and getting to editorial director, there were lots of jobs in between. So every couple of years, I've been doing something different, except for the sort of 8 years as editor in chief at Macworld, which is the number one reason I took the job I have now. Is I figured I'd done that job for 8 years, and it was a great job. It was sort of the job that I'd always wanted. But you do a job for 8 years, and you're like, I should probably try something else. So.
All right, so because you've been in like print publishing and now online publishing, which is something I sort of love to talk about these days, how has that transition been? Like, how have you seen that transition? Like, because right now print is sort of in decline, I guess. Nobody really knows. I mean,
it's either in decline or it's hit the bottom and it's just
basically
declined.
Yeah, because that was my point. But it's just like it can go lower.
Yeah.
Yeah, so how? I mean, I have a question I have written down, which is, how are you dealing with that? But that's a stupid question. But seriously, how are you dealing with that?
Okay, so I've got a couple answers there. One is personally, I am not dealing with it at all because I have always been interested in digital publishing and online publishing. In high school, I ran a bulletin board, and on it, I posted short stories, and I had a serial where a new chapter every week. And I'm not sure if anybody ever read them, but I did that. And when I went to college, I started a magazine that was distributed over the internet that was called Intertext. That was it was short fiction, but there was an ASCII version that we posted to news groups and you could get by email, and there was a postscript version. There weren't even PDFs yet that you could dump to a laser printer and get a laid out magazine. And so I've always been interested in that. And then in 96, I want to say, somewhere around in there, a bunch of my friends who are, a lot of them still doing the incomparable with me, actually started a blog, a very, very early blog called TV, which was about television, obviously, TEEVEE. And so, and my first job at MacUser was as online editor. So personally, I've always been interested in digital. And every now and then I talk to somebody who's like, well, so you come from a print background. And it's like, totally not. I worked for a print magazine because that was where the jobs were. And the web was not a thing when I got a job. But the whole time I was always thinking about the internet and online and then eventually the web. I actually had a conversation with one of the people who ran our online efforts at Ziff Davis in the 90s where I said, do you know about the web? We really need to do a website for MacUser. And the guy basically said, no, I made the website. And I said, we need to post this at macuser.com. I know we have the domain. We need to post this. And it was just like, how to subscribe and how to send us an email. It was nothing. It was just a presence. And the guy's response was, the future is on CompuServe, which is like, so for me personally, I love that, that the web has risen and digital has risen and seeing print decline is sad, but it was inevitable. It was an inevitable, when I started, it was inevitable because we saw all the online services and then the web coming up. So it was always inevitable. So it doesn't bother me. I think it's exciting. I mean, I do sometimes think about how comfortable it might have been to have a career in the mid to late 20th century where print media was so just incredibly static and incredibly profitable, because that must have been nice. But yeah. I was fortunate enough to be born in a time when the idea of putting ink on paper that had been huge for 500 years is in the midst of a 50-year transition from being the big thing to being gone, largely. And I get to live through that for my professional career. So that's fun. That's really cool. There's a lot of new stuff out there. This is why I do podcasts and I did an internet magazine. It's like, try out this new stuff and see what it's like. Career-wise, it is a challenge. And that's the part where, like, how is the company faring? How are media companies faring? How are the individual magazines' websites faring? And that's a harder question. I spent 5 years probably at Macworld wrestling with trying to get a staff to think about the web as the primary medium and not print. And that's actually been the case for many years now, that Macworld's editors don't think of the magazine as where they publish. They think of the web, and the magazine gets made afterward, and it's like the best of what we did on the web. That's been the case for a long time. And PC World has, since I took that over, that's been, in some ways, they were actually more advanced than Macworld in terms of thinking about the web as primary. In other ways, they were way behind and needed some serious change. And so I got to kind of beat my head against that again, which is it's not fun because, people like comfort, people like doing things, people like doing things the way they've done them and not changing. It's just, even if they know they need to change, they don't want to change. And you can get them to agree with you that they need to change, but then they don't change. And you have to go back to them and say, remember when we said you need to change? And they'll say, yes, totally. But they don't change, and that's been a big challenge. Is that not everybody, even in tech journalism, not everybody gets it, and really not everybody wants to embrace it because they're uncomfortable with the change. They don't like the rate of the pace. I don't mind the pace of online, which is like instantaneous because I used to do news, but some people they want to go at their own pace, and you can't do that as much on the web. Or or you want them to do videos and podcasts, and they're not comfortable on camera or in front of a microphone. So that part is really hard. And then from a business perspective, it's really hard because you've got, on the business side, even if you're doing good editorial content, the business is changing rapidly. And it's not just the medium that we publish to. We've been adapting to that as much as we can, I think, and doing a decent job of it. You could always do better. But on the business side, there's a whole other set of dynamics that are also happening where advertisers are abandoning print and going to the web. And then what they want on the web is different. And they want to buy audiences and not individual brands. And they want direct response instead of branding advertising. And that ends up leading to all sorts of turbulence in terms of the revenue's up, the revenue's back down. You got to do layoffs. Now we need more traffic, but you don't have any people because you laid them off, and that's been pretty turbulent. So it's funny. It's a challenge. It's been really hard, and I think I think we're kind of past it now in the sense that. In a sense that we have the print is almost like an aside now. It's like it happens for Macworld, and there's a digital magazine, but not a print thing for PC World. But it's not what we do. It's like we've got a group of people who do it after the fact because the web is really where we've been focused. And the challenges are not right now. I'd say my biggest concerns are all about the business and. More than they are about the content, although I've got some concerns about the content too. But it's about what people on the web want and how you make that happen with the resources that we've got. But that's life. That's how it works. It's not fundamentally about a change in media anymore. It's just about the changes in this medium of web publishing, which is different than going through a print transition like we did for 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, and the business side has to shake out somehow. That like some sort of like rules and I don't know. Yeah. Gravity needs to sort of become a thing there because now it's all floating around. At least that's how I see it.
If all web revenue 5 years ago was based on banner ads, and theoretically in 5 years there might be no banner ads, or they'll all be really lousy, banner ads. What happens? I mean, I think that's a real fundamental question, and I'm glad I'm not a business guy to answer it. I do ponder it a lot as an editorial guy. Like, what happens then? You've got these businesses that are built up on all this ad revenue, and there was a time when I thought that the media companies of the future would be all salespeople, and that the editors would just all be fired, and that they would have freelancers, and they would have computers writing things and databases, and my job would be over, and it would just be the salespeople. They would rule the earth. But for the last 5 or 10 years, I've been thinking, no, the future of the media is that the salespeople are all going to disappear, and it's just going to be the editors and writers, because they're making the thing that has value, and Google and its ilk are going to completely invalidate all of the ways that things get sold. Now, that's probably extreme, but some of that is happening. I mean, it is really hard to use those old sales approaches in a world where there are ad networks and ad exchanges and Google out there to do this stuff. So that'll be interesting to see. What's the right model for a media company? Is it a bunch of single people? Is it a collective of like 5 writers, or is there room for a 50 or 100 person company with salespeople and marketing people and an editorial staff and some staff writers and some freelancers? That's what we are, and I don't know whether that is a shape that will fit in the landscape in 5 years. I honestly don't know. It might, but it might be that what you really want is something like, a staff of 5 or 10 editors and writers, and then a couple business people and an ad network. I really don't know what the economics are going to be like.
Yeah, as a content guy, I hope you're right. That's what I'm going to say.
I'm encouraged. Yeah, I read those articles that say, unless you're the very best at what you do, unless you're the one or two best writers in your subject area, you will not be able to make a living as a writer in 5 years. And there's some truth to that, in that, if every city has its own newspaper reporter who's writing about politics, like national politics, you don't need those people. Or every city has 8 writers who are writing about the baseball team. You might only end up with 2. There's some of that is true, but I'm not entirely convinced that the only people who write about technology in 5 years will be The Verge and CNET. I don't think that's true. But we'll see.
Okay. Wow, that was actually like a hell of a lot more optimistic than I thought it was going to be.
Well, or we will all find lucrative jobs doing project management or woodworking or driving a garbage truck.
Oh wow! But like I told Glenn, I wish you guys would see how it is over here. It's just, because I think some of that optimism would just not be there, I think.
Yeah. So how is it over there?
Oh, it's, Europe, man.
Yeah. I don't know. I go back and forth with the optimism, but I see people out there, and not, you can't just point at John Grouper, but I see people out there who are, I think there's a business to be made writing good stuff and making good podcasts, having a loyal audience. I think there are small businesses to be made there. But that's the thing, is I'm not sure if I think the Verges of the world can probably make it. And I think, the Ars Technicas or the, Mac Stories of the world can make it, where it's like a couple of people. The question is, is there something in between? Because that's where all the traditional publishers are, is these in-betweens where there's huge overhead, but they've got these big sales staffs that come in and bring in $1 million. But if that goes away, I don't know. And yeah, not everybody can be a one-person Daring Fireball, because people aren't going to read 18 different Daring Fireballs every day.
Yeah. And you see, that's all through the prism of being an American, where there's 300 million people in the country.
Right. Yeah, fair enough.
That's the thing. Yeah, that's why I told Glenn, and he just, I blew his mind on a couple of points, basically.
well, I've got that episode in my podcast app, but I haven't listened to just the beginning where you talk about swearing in various languages. But I'll get to the rest of it. But yeah, it's. I mean, I think this is one of the smart things that Federico Viticci did when he launched Mac Stories in English. Is the beauty of the web is you can live in Viterbo, Italy, and become one of the best Apple websites on the planet, and get a big audience that's in all the English-speaking countries and all the other countries who have people who care about the subject and can speak or read English. And so he chose a really large market. if you're covering local stuff, and if you're covering it in a language that is only spoken by a certain number of people, it's a lot harder. And that, I would say, that's your predicament is very similar, I think, to the predicament of like local news in the U.S., where it's like we have a newspaper in my county that's not very good, and then like my city has almost nobody covering it. They tried patch.com, it didn't really work, and there's got to be a way to have, like, even if it's one person reporting about my local issues, and that's where essentially like the local issues in my town are just not covered anywhere independently by anybody, because the market's too small and the economics don't work. When in the old days, a newspaper would have been able to make it work because the economics were different. But now, it's just a wasteland. I think that's so.
That's sort of the vibe I was going
okay.
for. Yes.
All right. Yeah. Well, because then it's the small. I mean, tech is like, I have an addressable audience of everybody who reads English in the world who cares about technology. And yeah, there's some local differences if you're in Norway or if you're in Slovenia or if you're in Ireland or if you're in Brazil. But, you can, that's my addressable audience for tech. And if I was writing about Mill Valley or Marin County, or even the Bay Area, if I wrote about the Bay Area, my addressable audience is 7 million. Writing about technology in English, my addressable audience is what, 500 million at least. So, that's the scale really helps.
Yeah, I just love how you say 7 million, and Slovenia's 2 million people.
Right. Well, no, that's the perspective, right? Is that it's harder for us in the U.S. to get, is that, yeah, my region, the 7 Bay Area counties, I think is 7 million, and Slovenia is 3 million. So that's
two.
Or 2 million. 2 million. Yeah. I'm trying to think what would be a comparable U.S. region to 2 million.
The sheer fact that you can't even think that small is hilarious to me, that you can't find like a region.
Well, I did grow up in a small town, but Louisville, Kentucky is 1.5 million. But there's a Louisville, Kentucky market, but the idea is they also have all of the English language media, whereas with Slovenia you have 2 million, and that's the entire addressable market.
Basically, yes. So imagine how big a niche is over here. It's you and me, basically.
Right.
Yeah, that's sort of that's the mind frame here, I guess.
Cincinnati, Ohio, 2.2 million.
Yeah, see, it's 200,000. It's a lot when you're talking about
you're right. Right, but
okay, so we'll go to the last portion of the show.
Okay.
So, so we had the optimism and then the pessimism, I guess. So I ask each guest about their hardware and software, because that's what I write about mostly.
Yay, so, technology.
Your hardware, sir.
My hardware. I have a 2013 MacBook Air. It's the one of the privileges of being the editor of Macworld, the editor in chief of IDG, is that I get sometimes to pick my hardware. We test all the variations you can build to order of systems, and so whenever there's a new MacBook Air, they always get the ultimate configuration, which is a max out all the specs. Well, I have that in the 11-inch 2013 MacBook Air. So it's a 1.7 gigahertz Core i7 with 8 gigs with 8 gigs of RAM, and the gigantic what is this? The 512 gigabyte SSD. It's outrageous. It really is. Although I added all my podcasts on it, and little 11-inch MacBook Air. So at home, where I'm talking to you now, I have a little home office that I just set up with a little adjustable sit-stand desk and a Logitech Bluetooth keyboard and a Magic trackpad and a 23-inch Dell flat panel monitor. So when I work at home, I use this setup. The MacBook Air is in a Book Arc little stand from 12 South. And so I plug it all in, and it's like I'm using a desktop computer. I've got my blue my blue Yeti microphone on a boom arm hanging here off the side of the desk. And
awesome! I'm on the Yeti as well.
Yeah, and so this is my setup at home, and this is my podcasting setup. And then I will edit the shows on the same computer, and it's so fast that honestly, my old MacBook Air, the 2011 version, could edit in Logic, could edit like 10 audio tracks simultaneously without the SSD makes it all possible, and the i7 doesn't hurt. So that's my setup at home, and then at work I have a Thunderbolt display and a Logitech Bluetooth keyboard and a Magic Trackpad there. I tried to just buy the same stuff more or less at home and at work so that I didn't have to feel like every time I switched places it was weird. Although I didn't buy a Thunderbolt display for myself. I'm holding out. Maybe if there's a Retina display at some point, I'll replace this Dell. But the Dell monitor is pretty good and pretty cheap. And I got an iPhone 5S, and my iPad is an iPad Mini with Retina, which I love. I love the Mini. That's what I went with. The Air was really tempting, but I like the Mini size. Just did it for me. And what else would you like to know about my computer?
Just
things?
the Kindle, because you have a Paperwhite, I'm guessing.
I do have a Paperwhite, and I use it to read my daily newspaper. I actually read on that because I think it's a better reading experience than the crummy iPad app that they wrote that has ads and doesn't scroll right. And the Kindle is kind of pure, and it's just text on a page, and that's what I like. And that's where I read most of my novels too, is on the Kindle Paperwhite. And then in my living room, I've got in addition to the HD TV, there's a Mac Mini back there with a bunch of hard drives attached to it. That's sort of my media server. I've got squeeze boxes, Logitech squeeze boxes for music throughout the house. Okay. That's one of those examples of a great product that got bought and destroyed by the company Logitech. Actually, I'm also wearing Ultimate Ears headphones right now. Those are two companies that Logitech bought and destroyed, Slim Devices and Ultimate Ears, and neither of which are as good as they used to be, and it makes me sad because the squeeze boxes they're like Sonos for people who don't know what squeeze boxes were, and they're discontinued now, but they're very much like Sonos in that it's an all home audio stuff, and the music streams from the little Mac Mini that lives behind my TV set, and that's where I back up to, and I've got a couple backup drives there, and there's what else is back there? I don't know, a bunch of game consoles and things like that. But and an Apple TV. There's an Apple TV and a TiVo.
Of course, there's an Apple TV. So yeah, that's. I was going to write that down anyway. So.
Yeah, I've got a Roku somewhere too. But now that I've got a TiVo, that does pretty good Netflix, and so I only. And now that Amazon's streaming will do
Fire TV thing.
Yeah, I don't have that, but the Amazon streaming app on the iPad does AirPlay now. So you can get Amazon Video on the Apple TV, even though there's no app for it.
Oh, awesome! Yeah, we don't have Amazon Video because we don't have a localized Amazon.
Amazon is really bad internationally. That's a funny thing that people don't. People in the U.S. lose sight of that. If you draw a map of where Google, Apple, and Amazon are, you realize that Apple is in some ways the only one playing the international media game. It's really interesting.
Yes, which is sort of insane to me as to why Google isn't there. Like, I just do not understand that.
Yeah,
it's so weird. Yeah, Apple is, and saying that Apple has its shortcomings.
Oh, sure.
Like,
it's just ahead of the rest of them.
Yeah, basically, it's just so far ahead, but they're nowhere near to like where they should be.
Right.
Basically. Okay, so as far as software goes, just like the apps you actually use on your iPhone.
Right. On my iPhone.
Okay. Yes, on your iPhone.
Okay, apps I actually use on my iPhone. I was winding up to talk about the Mac, but I will talk about the iPhone. Twitterific is my Twitter client of choice. MLB at Bat for the Major League Baseball app because I'm a baseball fan. Instacast is my podcasting app. I can't wait to try Marco Arment's podcasting app, but for now it's Instacast. Fantastical on the iPhone I don't really like it on the iPad, but I like it on the iPhone and the Mac. Grocery IQ is where my wife and I keep our grocery lists. It's actually great. Dropbox. Vesper for notes.
The Gruber app, okay.
Romantimatic by Greg Noss, which reminds me every couple of days to send a text to my wife telling her I love her.
I saw that piece he wrote when he got this. Oh, that was like one of my favorite things from last month.
Yes.
I think
Controversial, but it's
but it's so well written. That was one of my favorite things I read. Yeah, I'm gonna put a link into that also. So yeah,
I think those are the ones. Yeah.
Okay, just one more. Like, do you have any iPad specific apps, like one or two that you just use on the iPad? Because that's sort of a thing I always ask. Because not something that has an equivalent on the iPhone, maybe.
Sure. Let's see. Well, I only read comics on the iPad, and I read them in Comixology or in Chunky Comic Reader, or I guess Marvel Unlimited. I read some there too. But there's a phone version, but I never use it on the iPhone. Squeezebox has there's a control app for Squeezebox actually called iPeng, like penguin, that is a guy in Germany writes, and there's an official one, but it's no good. And this is really great. And since I have that's my remote control for the all home music system. The TiVo app I use only on my iPad, where I can load shows onto it from my DVR. That's where I play threes. I don't play threes anywhere else, but on the iPad as it was intended. And I have the New York Times iPad app is great. So it's hidden away in Newsstand where I can never remember it. And I got to say, I don't use them as much as you might think, at least yet, but they're a pleasure to use. I have the Microsoft Office apps on here because we're an Office 365 company, and every now and then now I take great pleasure in opening one of those out. And also I got to put in a word for Google Drive. The Google Drive app is essentially Microsoft Office because you have access to all Google Docs. And it used to be really lame, and there was only kind of a preview of your Google Docs. But now you can edit a spreadsheet or a document from Google Docs right in that app on the iPad, and it's really great. So I use that a lot too now.
Yeah, we use it for the podcasts. Like Google Drive is where we do all of our notes, basically.
Yeah, that's what we use for the Incomparable. Is I've got a big spreadsheet, a Google spreadsheet with all the show planning and stuff.
Same here.
It works.
Right, so my last question, which is always the same: if you had to pick one like physical thing that isn't a person, so it can be your grandma, that made an impact on your life. You might still have it, you might not, but like just if you had to pick one, it can be a piece of technology or not. Like anything goes. What would that be?
One physical thing that had a big impact on my life.
Yes. I know you want to say the Apple too, but
But not a piece of technology?
Oh, it can be. It can be.
Well, what I really want to say is, and forgive me because this is going to be really boring, is the Mac SE, because that was the computer we had at the newspaper. That's the first Mac that I bought. And that was the thing that set me on the course to do what I still do 25 years later, 24, something like that, a long time ago later. It was that moment of using the Macs at the office and then buying one of my own, because I'm still using the Mac today. That's been an unbroken line. That got me into the Mac, which got me knowledgeable, made me start devouring Macworld and Mac User, got me my job and my career, and also I love it and all the things that I've made using the Mac. So this podcast has put me in a frame of mind of technology, but I've got to say I think that's it. I think that would have to be the thing. I've got a trusty old baseball bat that I used to use to play softball, but I don't think I'm going to pick that. I think I'm going to go with that original Mac SE that I had, because that did change the entire course of my career and my creative life too.
Well, yeah, you're a tech writer, so you can get away with that. Choosing. Jason, that's pretty much it. Thank you very much for doing this.
Thanks for having me. This was a great conversation. I really liked it.
Tole je bila 71. epizoda Aparatusa. Jasona najdete na Twitterju pod Snell z 2 l-joma. Jaz sem na Twitterju @anzet, tako da mi težite tam, ali mi pa lahko pošljete tudi mail na anze@aparatus.si. Predvsem pa hvala vsem, ki ste že donirali mreži Aparatus, oziroma če pa to hočete narediti, greste pa na aparatus.si/podpri. Vsak evro prav pride, ker s tem podprete moje delo in delo vseh, ki delamo pač te podcaste, tako da ful hvala. To je do naslednjega tedna to. Hvala, ki ste poslušali. Čau.